and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up on today's program, the US President Donald Trump gives Hamas what he calls a last warning. Release all remaining hostages in Gaza, or, he threatened, the people of Gaza will be dead. In a joint statement, France, Britain and Germany urge Israel to allow aid to be delivered to Gaza, describing the humanitarian situation in the enclave as catastrophic. Ukraine's defense minister says his country is working to find alternatives as Washington suspends military aid and intelligence sharing during the course of this week. And images are released of the Blue Ghost lunar lander, which touched down on the moon on Sunday. A second private US lunar lander is expected to reach the moon later on this week. Hello and welcome to the program. The US President Donald Trump has issued what he called a last warning to Hamas, telling the Palestinian group to release the remaining hostages in Gaza or, quote, there will be hell to pay. Well, President Trump also made it clear there would be repercussions for Gaza as a whole. Trump wrote, to the people of Gaza, a beautiful future awaits, but not if you hold hostages. If you do, you're dead. Well, President Trump's post came just hours after the White House confirmed that the US had entered direct talks with Hamas. Well, to date, the US has avoided direct dialogue with Hamas, which is designated by Washington as a foreign terrorist organization. Well, Trump's remarks followed on from a statement confirming that the US Special Envoy Adam Boehler has been given authority to engage with the group.
Well, when it comes to the negotiations that you're referring to, first of all, the special envoy who's engaged in those negotiations does have the authority to talk to anyone. Israel was consulted on this matter. And look, dialogue and talking to people around the world to do what's in the best interest of the American people is something that the president has proven is what he believes is good faith effort to do what's right for the American people.
Well, responding to President Trump's threats, civilians in Gaza have voiced concern, stating that President Trump should adopt a more neutral stance.
Trump's efforts should focus more on promoting peace and facilitating between the Palestinian factions and the Israeli army, particularly through the exchange of hostages and prisoners. He should avoid throwing threats, blame and intimidation at the people of the Gaza Strip, who are suffering and living the woes as a result of this war.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Ambassador James Jeffrey, former Deputy National Security Advisor and former United States Special Representative for Syria engagement, who joins us now from Virginia in the United States. Great to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Ambassador. This latest threat or ultimatum from President Donald Trump to Hamas, do you think it's likely to change anything?
First, thanks for having me on. It's hard to say. The world, even though we had 4 years of them from 2017 on, still has to get used to Donald Trump. Presidents and other leaders normally very carefully weigh what they say for specific intent. Trump is very different. He's issuing a warning to Hamas that he wants the hostages back, particularly the 5 remaining American ones, at least one of which is alive, or he will act in some way to put more pressure on them. Whether he will carry that out or not, we don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. That's the way it is with this president.
Do you get the impression this is the president firing off a message on social media, or do you think this is part of a broader strategy?
Well, everything Donald Trump does is part of a broader strategy. He just looks at it in a less precise way than we're used to. Trump believes that Hamas has lost Gaza. He believes Gaza itself is lost. But he also thinks that getting the hostages back is a very important priority for the American family members, but also for Israelis. So he's trying to use threats. How he'll carry them out, I'm not sure. But for the moment, he'll just throw this out and see what happens. The problem is that Hamas, if it releases all the hostages, does not have any cards to play anymore. and will face an Israel that is intent on destroying it one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, the ceasefire deal that took months and months to negotiate and for all parties to agree to is only sort of just past the end of phase one. I don't understand why it hasn't just gone into the second phase. What's happened to that ceasefire? Is it cancelled?
No, it's canceled sort of by the Israelis, but they haven't begun fighting again. They've just cut off supplies. They're sending a signal. The problem is that this ceasefire was never about a ceasefire in the Israeli withdrawal. It was about how Hamas would surrender and under which terms Gaza, because they've lost the war. And there was supposed to be negotiations, formal ones, in the second phase to work out that day after in Gaza. They never really got started, but the preliminary back and forth indicated that Hamas wanted to hang tough and basically had no intention of giving up its control over Gaza. So the Israelis were not very interested in going into a second phase, which, among other things, would mean its permanent withdrawal. So this still gets down to, does Hamas think it is lost or not? If it doesn't think it's lost and Israel, with Trump's backing, will continue fighting, then Hamas is due to get in Gaza another round of war.
And all the while, we understand the Trump administration is now in direct dialogue with Hamas. That's something that I think is without precedent. Is that something you think is to be applauded, or does that ring an alarm bell?
As a general rule, it's always good to talk to your enemies. That's one of the most important rules of diplomacy. The problem is typically, and I don't know if Trump will succumb to this, talking with one's enemies leads to Stockholm syndrome, when the talking itself or your false belief that the enemy is your friend leads you to make mistakes. Whether Trump does that or not, I don't know. But talking is okay. The other thing is the guy doing the talking is the hostage negotiator. And in numerous administrations, they've been authorized, unlike others, to talk to people on the terrorist list, to terrorists themselves, and to other people we don't like the Assad regime in the last administration, in order to get people back. But these talks are including also possible ceasefire options. And as you know, the last ceasefire deal put on the table was not by the Israelis. It was by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who said, let's just extend the phase one for another period of time. Hamas hasn't responded positively, but it's clear that more and more, be it with Ukraine or be it with Gaza, Trump is trying to take over the actual negotiation himself.
Yeah, and this is a recurrent theme throughout our program this evening. In fact, it's been a recurrent theme of the last few weeks. We've been talking a lot about, historical problems, historical wars and ideological battles. President Donald Trump is trying new techniques to fix some very long-standing issues. How do you rate his chances of success?
Hard to say. As I said, it's, first of all, presidents get to choose how they want to do things. Secondly, they're judged by whether they succeed or not. But I would note that it's not all that new. This is exactly what he did with Kim Jong-un of North Korea in 2017 through 2019. He dealt directly with him at the highest level, leader to leader. Obviously, the South Koreans were somewhat excluded, rather like the Ukrainians, rather like, to some degree, even the Israelis with the Witkoff ceasefire proposal. It's how Trump likes to do things. Trump's position, if he were here rather than me talking to you, would be, look, America is the big player. We're the one who guarantee, fill in the blank, Israel, South Korea, Ukraine security, but we have global interests. So we want these problems solved, wars ended, nuclear weapons to go away, but we want to do it on our terms because we have to consider the many other things we have cooking, including China, which is always on their mind.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Really appreciate you speaking to us, Ambassador James Jeffrey. Thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's get some more analysis, and we can speak now to Aaron David Miller, former U.S. Middle East peace negotiator, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, sir. President Trump has issued this warning to Hamas on social media, saying, release all hostages or else. What's your understanding of what or else could actually entail?
Look, at the same time, President Trump is using his true social media posts to threaten Hamas. He's broken through any number of conventional barriers by engaging directly with the organization. Hamas is a foreign terrorist organization by statute. According to American law, direct contacts and material support, among other things, are prohibited. It is and can be in the U.S. national interest for an American president or diplomat to engage with any number of bad actors. The U.S. has done it in the past. In the 1970s, CIA engaged with the PLO. Various administrations have engaged with Taliban, even people in the Haqqani network in the service of American national interest. So he's sending very mixed signals here. That's number one. Number two, Reuters is reporting essentially that negotiations have produced a sort of positive outcome and an approach to the second phase of the negotiation. Whether or not the Israelis are being apprised of these negotiations or even are directly involved is unclear. So right now it's a very confused picture, it seems to me. My bottom line is probably, if we're lucky, in terms of the security of the hostages and the people of Gaza, you'll get an extension of phase one. But at some point, it seems to me, the likelihood is that the Israelis will resume military pressure against Hamas, and I think the president will support them.
Yeah, because there are these 24 living hostages that we're aware of in Gaza. There are 34 others who are presumed dead. Why does President Trump think they're going to be released without adhering to this negotiation process, the roadmap for which was laid out in that deal that took months to get everyone to sign up for? And we're only at the end of phase one. Why is he not respecting that deal?
It's not a question of not respecting it. I think the reality is even the negotiators who conceived this deal, I think, were dubious in the Biden administration about whether the transition from phase one to phase two would ever occur. Phase two is not just a question of implementing the conditions in the agreement. It cuts to the core of the future of Gaza. And those questions are fundamentally unanswered. Number one, if the Israelis withdraw according to the terms of the agreement, who or what maintains security? For them, the shadow of October 7 looms very large. Number two, what about governance? Yes, the Arab Summit produced a plan, probably generated by an American consultancy, that talks about reconstruction, but it doesn't get at the issue of what happens to Hamas. Is it demilitarized? What role does it play in the governing structure of Gaza? And then, of course, you have the issue of humanitarian assistance and reconstruction aid. Who's going to pay for that, and how is it going to be implemented? None of these questions have reached the point where even if the parties implemented their respective commitments in phase two, and by the way, I don't think they will implement those conditions, the predicate has not been laid for how to deal with Gaza and to prevent its return into a free fire zone with bad governance and no sense of security for Palestinians who live there, not to mention creating prosperity for them. So
President Trump
this
says
is
he's
the
got
problem.
A plan. President Trump says he's got a plan to create lots of prosperity, turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, except it won't have any Gazan people living there by the sounds of things. They'll be forcibly relocated to neighboring countries. Do you think that plan is ever likely to see the light of day?
That plan is patently ridiculous. And it has validated the fantasies of the Israeli right. It has undermined American relations with Egypt and Jordan. And it doesn't advance the argument or the possibility of a solution. I think maybe the most charitable interpretation of that was that President Trump thought he would somehow motivate key Arab states to come up with their own plan, and he did. But the plan they've developed doesn't address the core issues that need to be addressed. And I think the lukewarm reaction by the Trump administration to what came out of the Cairo summit and the adamant opposition on the part of the Israelis suggests that that plan is going to be no more successful than President Trump's.
So where does that leave the situation if those two plans, in your view, don't really stand a chance? We need a third plan, don't we?
I mean, look, I've been around Arab-Israeli negotiations for the better part of 25 years. They tend to have two speeds, slow and slower. There's no trust between Israelis and Palestinians. There's no direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. The prospect, I was at the last serious effort to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at Camp David in July of 2000. That was 25 years ago. And on the 5 core issues, borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, and end of all conflict and claims, the gaps between Arafat and Barak were as wide as the Grand Canyon. And they've only widened since then. So if you ask for my best guess estimate, I think if you're lucky, you'll get an extension of phase 1, the release of additional hostages, dead and alive, the resumption of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, an asymmetrical number of Palestinian prisoners released. But sooner or later, without parties willing to undertake ending the war, freeing the hostages, releasing, Hamas is going to demand thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails. You're not going to be able to move this conflict to where it needs to be. And that is a sad and tragic development.
I mean, just to wrap up, I mean, this is a sort of a wild card question, really. But, you know, given the state, the level of trust that exists between the Palestinians and the current administration, and I think it's fair to say the previous administration in Washington as well, I mean, is the United States ever going to be able to broker anything with regards to the future Palestinian state, or does it just have to be another country?
No, I mean, there have been there's so much that is wrong with U.S. policy, even in the 25 years I was working the issue. But there's one politically inconvenient reality that people have to grasp. You need an Israeli and Palestinian leader who are masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies. You need an Israeli and Palestinian leader who has authority, credibility, influence, and who are in agreement over a common vision of how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you don't have those two leaders, I mean, I think the last 15 months of terror and horror and violence and death, beginning with Hamas's terror surge on October 7 and Israel's relentless punishing response in an effort to prosecute that war, which has led to the deaths of thousands of Palestinian civilians. If you don't have those two leaders, then going forward, the last 15 months is going to be the prologue, where no external actor, not the ICC, not the ICJ, not the United States, not the UN, was capable of influencing the behavior of the two primary combatants. And I know I'm speaking to Al Arabiya, but I will say this. The region's reaction to October 7 and the deaths, even if you subtract 17,000 Hamas fighters from the total of anywhere from 40 to 50,000 Palestinian deaths, the region's reaction to that tragedy that has befallen the Palestinian people, not a single Arab state did anything meaningful to either reset its relations with Israel or to bring any sort of pressure on the United States. And if the Arab states and publics, I realize most Arab publics live in authoritarian regimes and their capacity to express their views is quite limited. But if the Arab regimes themselves, including Israel's two treaty partners, Jordan and Egypt, couldn't do enough to care about the fate of Palestinians, why will the rest of the world? And that question is critically important. In addition to an Israeli-Palestinian leader, you're going to need Arab leaders to step up as well because you're going to need a regional solution.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to wrap up. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us once again.
Thanks for having
David
me.
Miller. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Itamar Rabinovich, former Israeli ambassador to the United States and former chief negotiator to Syria, who joins us now from Tel Aviv. Ambassador, it's great to have you with us once again. I'd like to start by talking about this warning issued by President Trump to Hamas. He's saying, release all hostages or else. What's your understanding of what happens if Hamas doesn't oblige?
I think President Trump tends to be a very emotional man, oftentimes guided by emotions. He met a couple of the hostages who have been released recently from captivity, and he was very much moved by their condition and by what he heard from them about the conditions under which they were held underground, undernourished, tortured, and so forth. And he's very moved by that. I think that's kind of his emotional reaction to this.
So when he says to the people of Gaza that if you don't do what I say, essentially you'll be, quote, dead in block capital letters, what's he got in mind, do you think?
President Trump is not exactly an analyst of Middle Eastern politics, and he doesn't distinguish between Hamas and the population of Gaza. When he is incensed by what he saw, his rage is directed not just at Hamas, but at the people of Gaza who have never actually distanced themselves from Hamas. That explains this part of the statement.
He said that a part of that an extension of that comment was that Israel will be given essentially everything it needed to, quote, finish the job. I mean, hasn't Israel spent most of the time since the 7th of October doing exactly what President Trump is threatening they're now going to do?
If there is, I hope there is not a renewal of fighting and that there is no need to have a second round. But if there is one, I think it's not going to be a replay of the first one. I'm not familiar with the details of the planning, but both the political leadership and the military leadership in Israel argue that it's going to be different. So, and what other clout does Trump or anybody from the outside have over Hamas but to threaten military action, and military action not by the United States. He's determined not to involve the U.S. In military action in Gaza or to that effect elsewhere in the Middle East, and the military force that would be left to do the job would be the IDF, the Israeli army. So that's the essence of this.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas didn't sound particularly bothered by this last warning, and it was quite similar to another warning where he said there would be hell to pay. Hamas saying, everyone should stick to that ceasefire agreement that was struck in January, and we're supposed to be now into the second phase of that deal. I mean, wouldn't it be better if we did stick to that deal? What's happened to that deal?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu does not want to go into the second phase because the second phase should lead to an end of the war, to Israeli retreat, which he doesn't want to do. Maybe on his own, and certainly because his extremist right-wing coalition partners threaten him that if he accepts or stays by the agreement and moves into the second phase and implements everything that's in the second phase, they would leave the coalition and the government. He would have to go to elections, which he is likely to lose, and he's determined not to do that. So maybe on his own, and probably because of this pressure, he just doesn't want to go into the second phase. There were efforts to go around the issue by suggesting that they just continue with a couple of additional phases or sub-phases of the first phase. Netanyahu has a deadline, which is March 31. March 31, they vote on the budget. The budget is an issue over which governments in Israel fall in Parliament. Once he crosses that deadline, he can feel quite safe. So if he's playing for time is defined by March 31 date.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Just wondering about another development that we found out about in the last day or so. The White House confirming that direct talks are taking place with Hamas, which I think is unprecedented. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you think that's something that's likely to worry the Israeli leadership?
It is worrying because it's a form of recognition, maybe legitimization, if external powers, particularly a superpower, deals directly with a terrorist organization. It does give that organization a certain kind of legitimacy, and it's awkward for Israel. Israel does not want to see that, but the White House attitude on this is a familiar trend or strand of American pragmatism. If you don't give me results on other tracks, then I will try the direct track, and if you don't like it that much, then too bad.
I mean, the United States prescribes Hamas as being a quote, terrorist organization. Do you think it's advisable, therefore, to hold these kind of talks and engage in this kind of a way?
We have seen earlier instances of U.S. administrations finding ways of overcoming this. I remember I was personally involved in President Clinton's visit to Damascus in 1994. And the question was, how can President Clinton go to visit Damascus and President Assad, father Assad, Hafez, when Syria is on the terrorism list? And they devised a formula that enabled the president to go to Damascus, which he did.
Just lastly, I mean, the people of Gaza must be quite confused at the moment. The Trump administration saying, on the one hand, cooperate with us or you're dead, essentially, which is what this latest warning was. On the other hand, they're being told that they'll be ideally forcibly relocated to Egypt or Jordan. I mean, some pretty confusing, mixed messages coming out of Washington to Gaza. Do you think it's fair to say?
Well, mixed messages from Washington seems to be the hallmark of these current times. But I think that the idea of forcibly relocating 2.2 million people from Gaza is not treated seriously today by anyone. It's the policy of, or the style of President Trump is to hit the table with a 20-ton hammer and then settle on something much more reasonable. He would tell you that I did that basically in order to get the Arab countries to deal with the reconstruction of Gaza and to help me to resolve the issue. And here they are holding a summit conference and dealing with the issue. So the people of Gaza don't really need to think about relocation, but they do need to think about how to bring an end to Hamas rule and how to proceed with reconstruction.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Always a pleasure speaking to you.
Sure.
Itamar Rabinovich, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, Israel is continuing its blockade on the Gaza Strip in a bid to pressure Hamas into agreeing to changes in the ceasefire deal. But the UK, France and Germany have criticised the move, stating that the Gaza aid freeze could violate international law. Well, in a joint statement, ministers from those three countries have called on the Israeli government to uphold its international obligations and ensure the full, rapid, safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza's population. Well, this includes the provision of essential items such as medical supplies, shelter materials, water and sanitation equipment. Well, for more, we can speak now to Bob Kitchen, Vice President, Emergencies and Humanitarian Action at the International Rescue Committee, who joins us now live from Nairobi. And just for the benefit of our viewers, the International Rescue Committee works in more than 40 countries and responds to the world's worst humanitarian crises. It was founded in 1933 at the call of Albert Einstein. Thank you for joining us. First of all, aid is being blocked from entering Gaza. Just to be clear, that means that civilians could start starving to death or dying of dehydration pretty soon.
That's absolutely right. The situation is dire. As you said, there's no aid going into Gaza, and the aid that we were able to get into Gaza over the last few weeks of the ceasefire is rapidly running out. In addition to that, what supplies were able to be transported into Gaza commercially are also running out, and that's driving prices up very rapidly. In the last 48 hours, a bag of flour has gone from costing $11 to $22. So not only are supplies running out, people are being priced out from accessing what is available.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine how people can even afford to buy anything, given that the past 18 months have meant zero gainful employment for the majority of people living in Gaza.
Exactly. I mean, despite the good work that we have been able to achieve during the period of the ceasefire, we're seeing 1 in 5 people are facing crisis levels of food insecurity. So despite our best efforts, the hunger situation is getting very, very severe.
Yeah, and let's just be clear. I mean, before the blockade even started, the population of Gaza was already facing acute shortages of food, water, and supplies. I mean, this just takes it to the next level, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. As you say, it's not just food and water. The medical situation inside Gaza is very severe. During the ceasefire, we collectively managed to get a huge amount in, but it represented less than 1% of the pharmaceuticals that were needed by a population of 2 million. Hospitals are running out rapidly of essential drugs to keep people alive. And what's frustrating, just the IRC on its own, we have 7 tons of the most urgently needed pharmaceuticals sitting in a truck waiting to go, and we're not allowed to bring it in.
I was going to ask you, what is the situation on the border? What's happening there?
Well, the supply chain required to meet the most urgent humanitarian needs of 2 million people is long and complex. So what that looks like is hundreds of trucks, warehouses full of commodities ready to go, and they're currently stuck. We can't get them in. We do not have permission.
And in terms of stockpiles, I mean, I've only heard from UNICEF, which, for example, says it doesn't actually even keep stockpiles. It just distributes what it has when it gets it. How long do you think it will be until aid groups are down to absolutely zero?
Well, we've already heard that 80 community kitchens who are serving free food are going to need to close down in the next few days. We've heard that organizations that are responsible for distributing food have already begun cutting rations to try and make their meager supplies last. The International Rescue Committee does have some what's called RUTF, which is ready-to-eat feeding for under 5s who are facing malnutrition. We have some on hand, but it's going to be only lasting a few weeks, if that. So the time is ticking. It's very, very concerning.
And what's the IRC doing to apply pressure on the relevant parties to get the situation rectified and to start getting that aid into Gaza? Or perhaps that's not part of your remit at all?
It is our remit. I'm sure yourself and your audience understand that the politics of the situation has only become more complex in recent months with the change of administration in the US. What we're doing is we're reaching out to all policymakers around the world to say that aid cannot be used as a bargaining chip between the parties to the conflict. The collective punishment that's happening at the moment towards 2 million civilians is something it's unconscionable. The women and children who are running out of food can't get access to healthcare, and the water situation is getting worse too. This cannot be allowed to happen. So everybody needs to start talking, and the aid needs to start flowing immediately.
And what does international law say about a situation like this? I mean, essentially, food has been weaponized.
Yeah, International law is clear. The implementation of international law has been slow in the last 18 months around this conflict. The international law says that Israel, as the occupying power, has the obligation to ensure the consistent and timely delivery of aid, no matter what. So it's pretty clear that both parties to the conflict have obligations here to ensure that civilians' most urgent needs are met consistently.
What do you think the next couple of weeks have in store for Gaza? I mean, do you think we might have a return to the previous situation where there was bombardment on a daily basis? What are your thoughts as to where things go to from here?
We're very worried about the ceasefire, as the first phase of the ceasefire is coming towards finality, moving towards the second phase. We're at a fragile moment in any conflict around the world with the global politics, the fatigue within the world's attention on Gaza. I think we're at real risk of seeing that ceasefire fall over in the coming weeks. So all attention should be paid to try and keep that going. Otherwise, we will return to widespread bombardment and violence, where the parties to the conflict, it's the civilians caught in the middle of those two parties to the conflict that are going to suffer the most.
Yeah, I mean, both sides signed that ceasefire deal that was negotiated by the outgoing Biden administration, the incoming Trump administration. Phase one seemed to sort of be adhered to, more or less, until the final phases. I mean, what happened to that deal?
I don't know. As an aid worker, we're most focused on making sure there's continual delivery of life-saving aid. We are buffeted by the changes in politics and the fragility of the ceasefire alongside everybody else, and we don't have a unique view on that. All I can say is that ceasefires, when they move between phases in any conflict, there's always one party to the conflict or another that thinks that there's an opportunity for renegotiation, and that makes it's super risky right now as we move between phases.
And just for the benefit of our audience who might not know the geography of Gaza and how aid gets in and out, there is obviously the Rafah crossing with Egypt, and then the other crossing points in the north, I believe, of the Gaza Strip. Are you saying that basically no aid can get through any of these border crossings, or is there a chance that perhaps one crossing might open eventually, perhaps the one on the Egyptian border?
Well, the Egyptian border is obviously controlled by the Egyptian government on their side, but it's controlled by the government of Israel before you get to Gaza itself. So they have that line of control between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. So the entire line around Gaza is completely controlled, and right now is completely sealed. So none of what are essentially 2 or 3 crossing points that have been allowing aid to cross in, none of them are open for business right now. And we can only stress the urgency of as many of those crossings opening as rapidly as possible before we start seeing lives being lost as a result of this brinkmanship and renegotiation.
And just lastly, before we crossed you, we were explaining that the International Rescue Committee was founded in 1933 at the call of Albert Einstein. I mean, this is a difficult question for you to answer, I'm sure, but what do you think Albert Einstein would make of the situation we're in 90 years on?
I mean, Albert Einstein was a big mind, but he believed greatly in peace and helping those who are in most urgent need of intervention. And right now, it feels like, politics aside, it's the women and children on the ground in Gaza that are suffering. So I think his counsel would be to open the gates and let the aid go in.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Bob Kitchen at the International Rescue Committee. Thank you very much indeed. Now, France says it is providing intelligence to Ukraine after Washington suspended sharing its intelligence with Kyiv earlier on this week. The CIA Director John Ratcliffe says the United States paused intelligence sharing with Ukraine after a dramatic breakdown in relations between Kyiv and the White House. Well, US intelligence is vital for Ukraine to track Russian troop movements and select targets. Well, the United States has shared intel with Ukraine since the early stages of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Well, European leaders, including the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, have been holding talks in Brussels to discuss ramping up defense spending and reaffirming support for Ukraine. Well, their meeting comes after Trump's suspension of military aid to Kyiv fueled concerns that the EU can no longer rely on the United States. Well, according to NATO, Washington provided more than 40% of military aid to Ukraine last year. Well, today, the British government said it had struck a deal with the defense tech company to allow Ukrainian armed forces to use more advanced attack drones in the Black Sea. The Ministry of Defense said that the contracts, totaling some $38 million will result in Anduril UK supplying drones to Ukraine. Well, the United Kingdom has already provided more than 10,000 drones to Ukraine's armed forces, which it uses to detect advances by Russian forces. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Malcom, Nance, a former US intelligence officer who joins us from New York. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Malcom. I mean, it's been a hugely eventful week or so on the Ukrainian sort of diplomatic front. I mean, some quite old issues here, I mean, dating back to really the Cold War, but we're seeing a brand new approach from the Trump administration. Do you think we should applaud that?
Well, you certainly shouldn't applaud that. I mean, what you're seeing is an approach from the Trump administration that goes back to Donald Trump's early days in 1988, when he was very much charmed by the Soviet Union, visited there, and then in the 2000s wanted to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, and somehow seized Russia and its dictator, Vladimir Putin, as someone to be admired. This is not just an administration change from the last 4 weeks. This is a change that is 249 years old, where America is turning away from democracy and towards authoritarianism.
So it doesn't sound like you think anything good is going to come out of this rapprochement.
No, and you know, I know a lot of people who know Donald Trump personally, have known him for decades, including his lawyer, Michael Cohen. This is not hardball as usual. Going up in there and then making absolutist demands and expecting to get 50%. This benefits Russia only. And again, it goes to Trump's belief that Russia is an untapped gold mine of money, and that Ukraine, which he views through a completely unrealistic worldview that has nothing to do with the realities of the ground in Ukraine or what U.S. intelligence is telling him. Trump believes in a fantasy world that Ukraine is completely destroyed, its army is ready to collapse. Nothing further can be from the truth. And he's acting out in that way, in an extortionate mafia boss way of trying to get a lot out of Ukraine for nothing, but it all still benefits Russia.
I mean, pulling the intel on Ukraine, I mean, what are going to be the consequences of that for Ukraine on the battlefield and for this conflict as a whole?
Well, it certainly doesn't blind Ukraine completely. What it does is there are two particular areas of intelligence collection which the United States has dominance on over the rest of the world. One is strategic intelligence collected through satellites, in which the Russian battlefield, its logistics, its positions are all scrubbed by U.S. intelligence, and we get very pinpoint information about where their units are, where they're moving. Ukraine has that capacity as well. Their human intelligence in that part of the world, their spies inside of Russia and in the occupied areas, is second to none. But you cannot marry that up with the second part of intelligence, which is where those satellite units detect high-value Russian targets, and then that data is passed into the rockets of the high-mobility multiple rocket launch system by the stroke of a key, and you can get a unit that comes into place, and HIMAR rockets can be devastating it in a matter of minutes. That is going to take some working around, fusing French, German, civilian, and British intelligence to actually filling in for the United States.
Okay, so you're saying that other countries can fill that void to a certain extent. But in the meantime, is this going to mean that basically Ukraine isn't deploying or can't deploy weapons as efficiently as it would do otherwise? And does this also mean a greater risk for Ukrainian civilians?
Well, the risk for Ukrainian civilians already made itself present when Trump cut the information and broke with Ukraine. Within hours, Vladimir Putin showed his pleasure by using rockets to bombard civilian areas in the city of Kyiv, which is Vladimir Zelensky's hometown. So they killed civilians in celebration of this. This is a brutal dictator who doesn't care one way or the other. However, the Ukrainian army is not blind. As I said, they have the capacity to send drones out to get information from civilian intelligence agencies, satellites, to contract very high quality information. The British, the French, others have satellites that will have to be retasked away from their national resources in order to fill in for the United States. So it's a short-term victory for Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin only. Ukraine is going to fight this battle. I was a member of the Ukrainian International Legion. I was in the Ukrainian army for almost a year, and I didn't have strategic intelligence coming from the United States. The top decision makers did. Our front on the battlefield, we used our eyes, our ears, and our drones, our ISR capacities, and we still killed Russians where they needed to be killed.
I mean, obviously knowing Ukraine as well as you do, and it's great to draw on your knowledge of the country and the situation on the battlefield. How do you think events these last 6 or 7 days that have been, watched with amazement by people across the globe, how do you think they'll have been felt by people on the battlefield, Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield? Do you think they'll be feeling, a drop in morale at this stage?
I maintain connections with my battalion. I help fundraise for my battalion, the International Legion Battalion. And let me tell you, they're motivated. But what they are is they're very angry at America. Look, not every piece of ammunition and equipment comes from the United States. 20% of it at the top. But, artillery tubes, various types of high caliber shells, which have advanced sensors, the multiple rocket launch system rockets, the Patriot missile system, of which Germany is giving new missiles, but the United States is shooting itself in the foot. When this war is done, when Ukraine wins, there is going to be a retooling of every army in Europe. They are using their war stocks, expending this. And what they are finding now is that you cannot trust the United States. A president who has decided he's going to support a dictator could at will cut off United States resources from an ally. And this is going to block U.S. defense completely out of Europe, as Europe is about to spend $1 trillion, nearly $1 trillion, in revitalizing their entire defense industry. The Ukrainians will persevere. Let me tell you something about Ukrainians. They will fight with sticks and rocks. And that's how it was at the beginning of this war. They have the advantage. They're beating the Russians. The Russians could, in fact, collapse in the next year. And when that victory comes, the United States is going to be out of it.
Yeah, I mean, just lastly, this is a real watershed moment, it seems, for Europe. That's what we've been hearing all week from major European capitals. Some might say a long overdue wake-up call for Europe. President Trump did warn them during his first term that they needed to get their defensive act together.
Yes, but he warned them in such a way that it was more of an extortion racket than it was actually trying to work with our allies. I've written 4 New York Times bestsellers about Donald Trump and his relationship with Russia, Vladimir Putin, and Russian intelligence. It was very easy to predict back in mid-2016 that this is the route he was going. It's just he didn't know how to get there back in his first administration. And he has taken such umbrage with Vladimir Putin. Putin got him his first impeachment, with Vladimir Zelensky. Zelensky got him his first impeachment when he wouldn't be extorted through Javelin missiles into creating a fake investigation into Joe Biden. Trump is a outrageous narcissist. And he has, as his niece, Mary Trump says, he suffers from narcissistic injury very simply. And when he does get injured, when he doesn't get his way, he throws a tantrum and then he takes revenge. Very well-known psychological factors about Trump. Vladimir Putin, ex-KGB officer, knows this also and manipulates easily Trump into believing that Russia's interest is Trump's interest and that there's some profit at the end for all of this. All this did was break a major component of the Atlantic Alliance, of which, by the way, Donald Trump did not even know in his first administration NATO was a defensive alliance. He thought it was a trade alliance. Anything that does not financially benefit him, he discards, and he is now discarding Ukraine.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Malcom Nance, former U.S. intelligence officer. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure.
And finally, for today's program, the US firm Firefly Aerospace has scored its first landing on the moon with a Blue Ghost spacecraft. It touched down in the Mare Crisium Basin, which is north of the moon's equator. Well, Blue Ghost has become the second privately built vehicle to land on the moon successfully. 5 nations, amongst them China, India and Japan, have made successful landings in the past. Well, Blue Ghost is expected to study the moon's surface for a period of around 2 weeks. Well, for more, we can speak now to Dr. David Whitehouse, a space expert and author of the book The Moon, a Biography, who joins us from the south of England. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Blue Ghost images have been released. I just want to start by asking you what you made of them.
I thought they were the most spectacular images of the lunar surface sent back since the time of the Apollo astronauts. They were beautiful, they were crisp, they were sharp. Not only does it show the shadow of the Blue Ghost lander stretching out across Mare Crisium, you can see small craterlets, you can see interesting objects in the structures in the distance. It's upright, it's in the right place, it's perfectly poised to carry out the various experiments it's going to carry out. But the pictures of it on the surface, the panorama, the sunrise, and especially the landing where you saw the lunar dust spread out as it came down in the last few meters, were just spectacular. They cannot fail to inspire anybody. That lunar exploration is interesting scientifically and spectacular to watch.
Yeah, they're amazing, aren't they, those pictures? I think the resolution of photography has really helped us appreciate those kinds of pictures as well. It feels like there's a bit of a rush to the moon all of a sudden. I don't know if you think that feels like the case as well, but I mean, why do you think that is?
Well, there is a rush to the moon because it's part of a few years ago when people realized that NASA, the National Space Agency of the United States, was rather slow. And could do things, but was expensive and took a long time. And along came Elon Musk with his SpaceX, which in other spheres of launching satellites and using reusable rockets showed NASA to be cumbersome. And therefore, when actually President Trump, during his first term, looked around and said, when is America going back to the moon? And NASA said, well, we might put people on the moon in 2028. Trump said, that's too late. Get on with it and do it quicker. So not only did he inspire the American Space Agency to start their initiative to put people on the moon and bring in collaborators such as Musk and Jeff Bezos, but it started a whole new ecology of smaller companies who felt that the moon was in reach of their own company and not a space agency. And the Blue Ghost lander and the Athena lander, which is going down in just over 2 hours' time down near the South Pole, are private companies. They have received very little help from outside. They've built, they've designed, they rent their equipment, their experiments on the surface of the moon. And they're doing very well indeed, as we've seen already this week.
So you're saying that President Trump has, in some ways, presided over a new sort of golden age of space travel?
Yes, in a sense, yes, but things as I suppose is the case with President Trump, it's not quite that simple. He certainly did kickstart the American return to the moon during his first presidency. Perhaps that's because he anticipated a second term and wanted to be a sitting president when America went back to the moon. So he did start that ball rolling. And NASA was instructed to bring on SpaceX with Elon Musk and Blue Origin with Jeff Bezos to design a system to go to the moon. However, since then, that project called Artemis has fallen behind schedule, has cost a lot more. And it's clear that the Artemis project of putting people back on the moon in just a few years' time is failing. And it may well be that during his second presidency, Trump will send Elon Musk in with his Department of Government Efficiency to trim some fat from NASA. And the project he set up, Artemis, may well be cut back quite severely. And the task of putting astronauts back on the moon may go directly to SpaceX and to Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin. So what started off as a kickstart for NASA in Trump's first term is turning to be a bit more complicated now that it's delayed and now that they're looking to make savings. But one thing is clear, America has its eyes set on the moon. Even though in the recent inauguration speech, Trump said he wanted to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars, the moon still is the most accessible and easy to explore object in the solar system.
I mean, what's up there, and what's it hoped that these lunar landers are going to bring back to planet Earth with them?
Well, there is the exploration for the exploration sense, in the sense that the moon is a relatively unchanging object that holds within its rocks and on its surface the history of the solar system and the history of the sun. So we learn a great deal about where we live and indeed about the history of the Earth by studying the surface of the moon and by understanding how it works and how it was formed. But if we want to build a moon base on the moon, and the next step is not just to go there, stay a few days and come back, but to stay for a substantial period of time, then that probably involves going to the South Pole, as this Athena lander in a few hours' time is going to do, and as other probes have done. Because in the darkness of the craters of the South Pole, there is water ice. Now, water ice is a very precious resource on the moon. Not only could you use it to have water to drink, but also it could irrigate. You could get air to breathe, oxygen to breathe. But liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, the constituent of water, are rocket fuel. So if you want a base on the moon, then many of these small companies are doing the ground truth research of getting down there, finding out what it's like, understanding the surface, finding out where the ice is, so that eventually, when they've gathered the data relatively cheaply with their small spacecraft, you can start planning to put a much larger spacecraft with people down near the South Pole.
Right, so they could sort of refuel and then go on from there to other places in the solar system, you're
That's
saying?
a possibility, yes.
You're quoted as saying that these lunar landings could help pave the way for Mars landings. Why is this a significant step towards Mars, do you think?
Well, it may well be that President Trump is going to pivot the American space effort from the moon towards Mars, because it fears that China might actually get boots on the moon before the Americans could. But certainly, if you want to go to Mars, Mars is a completely different type of mission. It's a much longer mission, far more dangerous. We don't have the technology. But what you can do on the moon is practice. You can practice long duration missions. You can practice living on the surface of a foreign body. Mars itself, like the moon, has ice below its surface. So when you understand how to extract ice and use it at the lunar poles, then you've developed some of the technology you would need to survive on the red planet. And there's just two schools of thought with this. One is that you go to the moon to build a moon base, And for all the reasons you can do that, science, technology, inspiration, etc. The other is that you go to the moon to learn how to go further into the solar system, perhaps onto Mars. Some people think, and perhaps Trump might be thinking this, that perhaps it might be wise to actually have a big effort to go to Mars directly. And this is part of the uncertainty we've seen in not only in the space program, but in many other areas of American administration over the past few months.
How far off is a Mars landing, in your opinion?
Well, actually, the first person to walk on Mars is already among us. They're probably about 20, 25 years old, studying engineering or science, and they could come from many different countries. They're already among us. They don't know it yet. They haven't signed up because the first trip to Mars is probably about 10 years away, 15 years away or so, the mid to the late 2030s. It'll probably be a precursor mission of actually going to Mars, flying around and not landing, because that is a very difficult thing to land on Mars. It's the most difficult landing in the solar system. And if you don't understand how your crew fared on a one-year flight to Mars, you wouldn't want to put them through the stress of what would be a great difficult task. So it may well be that the first crew to go to Mars will go there and fly around it and come back and leave the landing for the subsequent crew, who will take advantage of all the data that's been gained from the way the first crew were able to live and survive in space. Because, you know, make no mistake about it, living and surviving on the transit between the Earth and Mars will be very difficult indeed. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how the human body responds over such long periods, and we'd have to work out the technology to protect them from the hazards of, say, solar radiation. So Mars is a fascinating new world. It's a completely different world from the moon. The moon is airless and dry, but Mars is the first new world of the cosmos. It has canyons, it has craters, it has mountain ranges, it has deserts with shifting sand dunes, it has morning mist, it has clouds, it has moisture on the surface. It's a much more active, recognizable, colorful world than the moon. It's just so much further away and so much more difficult to get to.
And we were saying in the introduction that lots of countries are all of a sudden interested in the moon. I mean, obviously, there have been historically lots of other countries apart from the US interested in space travel generally. I mean, obviously, if all the countries got together and collaborated and joined forces, I mean, humankind would go much further in its quest to explore the universe. Do you think that's likely, or do you think this is going to remain quite a protected, nationalistic pursuit, exploring space?
Well, despite the intensive collaboration that takes place in space with the European Space Agency,
sure,
NASA and everything else, yes, the moon is a very special kind of prize. The Americans knew that in the 1960s when they were racing the Soviets to the moon, and they won. And they turned their back on it, if you like, and they've had various half-hearted starts to return. But now with the resurgence of China, with its aggressive, with its very capable and steadily improving space program, China has said it wants to put its astronauts on the moon by 2030. And given the problems America's had with its Artemis program, there are indications that it's accelerating that. So America is now in a race to go to the moon. Now, you could say that China is just repeating what America did 50 years ago, but there is no substitute for being there and seeing your crew on the lunar surface. So for the first time in over 50 years, we have a serious race. China sees the moon as important for its development, its image, because when you look up at the sky and see the moon wherever you are on the Earth, they want you to think there are Chinese astronauts on the surface and they are part of the future. And combating that and dealing with that competition is part of the problem America faces with its space program at the moment.
Now, of course, the moon landings, the first ones, more than 50 years ago, 1969, a lot of people have always sort of felt that there was something not quite right about them. And I think in 1970, a poll was done that said that 30% of American respondents thought they'd been faked. That continues to this day. Do you think, these kinds of images being beamed back from the moon by the lander we were just talking about help perhaps put some of those theories to bed?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, you try and talk to the astronauts who actually went to the moon and tell them that they didn't and they were faked, and you see what sort of reaction you would get. Buzz Aldrin was once the second man on the moon, was once approached by a guy holding a Bible and said, "Put your hand on the Bible and swear you went to the moon." And Buzz Aldrin's response was to hit him on the nose. The conspiracy theories, particularly in the time of internet and social media, can spread not, very rapidly, we know these days. And even when, back in the 1970s, there were people saying the moon landings were faked in studio hangars in Hollywood. There are always, frankly, stupid people who will deny the evidence in front of them. So, yes, there are people who you could not convince them otherwise. No amount of fantastic images from space that we've seen this week, no image of an astronaut from China or America walking on the moon will convince them that that is real. But that is life. But the fact is, it's unquestionable that we walked on the moon, we explored the moon, and it was one of the greatest triumphs of human civilization. And we should be proud of it. And frankly, we should do it again.
Yeah, well, hopefully those images we've just been talking about will help people realize that perhaps the moon landings weren't fake. I just want to ask you, what made you so interested in the moon to the extent you've written about it extensively? It seems to be a great source of intrigue for you personally. Where does that come from?
Well, the moon is such a wonderful object. It's more than a ball of rock. It's been entwined with human history and psychology since we first looked up at the moon. You can't say it's a ball of rock. You can't strip it of its myth and mystery. It has an influence on us psychologically, historically, scientifically. It's a wonderful object. Now, I grew up in the industrial Midlands of England, where the streetlights were quite powerful and you couldn't see many stars. Stars were difficult to see. And I was interested in astronomy, but wherever you are, even if you're in the most light-polluted, overpopulated city, the moon is there. You can, with a pair of binoculars, look at the moon and see some incredible detail there. It's not drowned out by floodlights or by city lights. So it's accessible to everyone. And it was accessible to me. And I had to argue with my father to let me stay up to watch the first footprints on the moon, because there was no way I was not going to witness that. And it changed my life. I've never been the same since. I've never gotten over it. That's why I hope that the youngsters who see the next first footprint on the moon, the 13th person to walk on the moon in a few years' time, whatever nationality they are, will have their lives changed and want to explore the moon over the next 50 years or so, write about it, develop technology that can be used to explore the moon, and also have spin-off technologies to enrich life on Earth. The moon gives us so much. And I hope the renewed interest in the moon shows people just how exciting it is to look at the moon, even from your backyard.
Okay, well, it's certainly given us plenty to talk about. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Dr. David Whitehouse, a great pleasure speaking to you. That is all we have time for on Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a wrap of the best interviews of the week. Until then, bye-bye.